All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Azure Infrastructure as Code Live. Hope you're all having a good day and you're ready to do some learning about Azure policy and infrastructure as code. I was trying out some new streaming setup tonight. So if there are any issues with the stream or anything, just let me know and I'll try and sort it out. Hopefully it's all pretty straightforward and it should work as expected. Okay, so yeah, today we're going to talk a bit about Azure policy and how we can use infrastructure as code to create policies. And we're doing this in honor of an event that's going on this week called Azure Spring Clean. So this is something a couple of guys, Joe and Tom, are doing to actually encourage well-managed Azure tenants. So looking at things like governance, policy, security, cost management, all those sort of things. So this is just a series of articles through the course of this week that people are doing on their individual blogs, but they are linked back to the event. So you can see there's been a couple sets published already. So 4 on each day. Yesterday, looking at cost management, Azure Identity, deployments using Bicep, which obviously we've looked at before. governance, and then today things like Network Watcher, lab environments, high availability and resilience. And then I've got an article that I published today on using Azure policy to replace pod security policies in Kubernetes. So if you're interested in any of those things or any other sort of governance and well-managed tenant pieces, I'd recommend you check out the Azure Spring Clean site and have a look at that. And you can see that. I'll post a link in the chat now as well, so you can have a look at that. So yeah, in honor of that, we're going to have a look at how you can do Azure policy through infrastructure as code. So if you're not familiar with Azure policy is a way you can put governance and rules around your Azure tenant to restrict what people can do, what type of resources they can deploy, where they can deploy them, and so on. So policy is a tab in the Azure portal, and there are a load of pre-built policies available to use, as well as the ability for you to actually create your own. So if we have a look in here in definitions, and we can see some of the pre-built policies. And we'll start just looking at policies. I'll talk about initiatives in a minute, but these are the individual policies. So you can see there are lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of policies here that allow you to define things. And so, let's take a look at a few examples. You can enforce that batch accounts got to have private endpoints enabled. You can enforce that Azure backups got to be enabled on virtual machines. You can enforce that you've got to use private clusters with Kubernetes. You can say we can only deploy Cosmos DB databases into specific locations. And there are hundreds of different policies. And so you can be very restrictive or controlling about what you allow your users to do. And you can either actually enforce these policies, so you can actually prevent people from doing that. So let's say you create a policy that says you can only deploy virtual machines in West Europe and North Europe, nowhere else. We're not going to support any other regions. If somebody then tries to deploy a virtual machine to East US 2, then that will actually fail, and it will prevent that from being deployed. You can also put them into audit mode, and audit mode will not prevent you from actually deploying anything, but it will allow you to audit people who are currently breaking the policy. And the most common reason for this is you can actually go and report on that, and you can say, okay, well, we've got 100 VMs that are in a location we don't support. Before we enforce the policy, we need to go through and we need to talk to the people who own those VMs and have them moved to the right location and so on. So two different modes you can look at, and you can use these built-in policies, or you can create your own. And this is where we'll start getting into the infrastructure as code piece. So policies themselves are just written in a JSON language, which is very similar to ARM templates. In fact, it basically uses a very similar, a lot of the same components of parameters and variables and so on. But within that, you have this language which you use to actually define the policy. And so you can see here, this is where I actually define what the policy does. So it's got an if statement, and it's checking to see if the field type equals document DB database accounts. This is basically checking and say if the resource that's being created is a Cosmos DB, which is what that's field name. Document DB was the old name, and it's not changed at the back end. And then I can check if the location of that database, so this is location here, is not equal to my list of locations I've defined in this list of allowed locations, which is a parameter, so I can vary that. Then it will do my effect, which will either be audit or deny, depending on how I've configured this policy. So this is the actual definition of the policy, but this isn't actually used at this point This is just allows me to define what the policy looks like. I would then assign the policy to my resource group, subscription, or management group, passing in some parameters, which would include the effect and the list of allowed locations. And that assignment is what would actually get executed when somebody tries to create a resource. And it would then, that would actually prevent somebody creating the resource or give an audit warning or so on. So we can have a look here at the compliance on my tenant, and you can see I've got pretty appalling compliance, mostly because most of these policies were enabled as part of demos. So I wanted to show that they're not working. So there's not a massive amount of compliance, but I've enabled some policies here. So for example, we have a policy that in fact, I've used the Azure Cosmos DB one, but let's have a look at one that's actually got some data on it. Yeah, so I've got an audit one here, which looks at secure storage and storage accounts. So whether HTTPS is enforced on storage accounts. So I've turned that on in audit mode. And we can go have a look at this, and it will tell me that actually only a certain amount, in this case 68% of my storage accounts, have this enabled. So I've got 14 storage accounts that are not compliant. They don't have HTTPS enabled. You can see what those storage accounts are. I don't think I've got one. No, I haven't. But you can also configure remediation tasks for these policies. So I don't have one for this. I could probably create one. But this would allow me, if I did that, I'd have this button available. And I could click on that, and that would basically run through all the storage accounts that don't have HTTPS enabled, and it would turn it on for me. It would fix that problem for me. That would fix any existing storage accounts. Then we could turn this from audit into enforce, and that would actually prevent anyone from creating a storage account that doesn't have HTTPS enabled. And we could even go a step further, and there's another type of policy, which is a God, what's it called? There's a name for it. See if I can find one. There you go. Yeah, deploy. There's another, this deploy if not exists option. So this takes things a step further, and says not only if I'm a user and I try and create a resource that doesn't have this enabled. So this example, this is deploying log analytics to a Windows Azure Arc machine. It's a bit specific, but if I do that and I deploy a VM that doesn't have this enabled, this won't prevent me from doing it. What it will actually do is it will go ahead and update that machine to actually have, in this case, the log analytics agent on it. So inside my policy, what I've actually got is an ARM template here. So this is, you see this looks like the nested template format. That's because that's exactly what it is. So I've got this ARM template with some parameters and some variables. You can see it looks like ones we looked at in the past. And it's deploying a virtual machine extension onto that. And that is just an ARM template embedded within the policy. So now if I were to deploy or if I was to onboard a Windows machine into Azure Arc, it would get detected by this policy. If it doesn't have the log analytics agent on it, then it will automatically get deployed by this policy for me. I won't have to do anything at all, and that will sort that out. So we have three things we can do. We can either audit and just flag up that something's not following policy. We can enforce it, which will stop anyone creating a resource that's not in compliance with policy. Or we can deploy if not exists and actually fix it so that it complies with policy when we deploy it. So anyway, that was a rather long-winded explanation of what policies are and how they work, but I think that's important before we get onto the next stages. If anyone's got any questions on any of this or anything else infrastructure as code related, just stick it in the chat. I will be happy to answer those. But yeah, now we'll have a look at how this actually works in terms of using infrastructure as code. And so there are really probably 3 things to be aware of that we're going to have a look at creating. We've got definitions, we've got assignments, and we've got initiatives. So definitions, as we already talked about, are where you actually declare the policy. So we'll have a look at that later. For the minute, we'll use some of the already pre-built policies before we delve too deep into those. But we've got assignments, which are how you actually assign a policy to a scope, be that resource group, management group, subscription, to be actually used. And then you've got initiatives. Initiatives are a way that you can group multiple policies together, so you can assign them in a big lump. So when we go back to our definitions and we have a look in here and have a look at initiatives, you can see, so initiatives are around a certain aim usually. So there's one here that actually applies NIST guidelines, so the National Internet Security Task Force, I think, or something like that. So there's 77 policies within this initiative, and these, I imagine, are all around security. Yeah. So how you secure your Azure subscription and the resources in it. So if you deploy this policy and you audit all your resources or enforce all your resources and everything's green, then in theory you're in compliance with NIST SP 800-171R2, whatever that means. There's a few others. So some of them are, there are specific security ones. Some of them are related to a specific task. So you're trying to audit machines which don't have log analytics agents on. They've got a couple on. There's an Azure security benchmark with 189 on. UK official NHS ones. There are a lot of ones around security compliance, but there are some other ones as well that are trying to find one that's a bit more interesting, that's not just a security related one. A lot of them are. Okay, there's one here for Windows machines should meet the requirements for Azure Security Center baseline. And I suppose that's security as well, really, isn't it? A lot of them are security related. I've got a couple that I've created. So one of the ones actually I mentioned in the article I talked about today. So when you're migrating to use pod security policy or to use Azure policy instead of pod security policies in Kubernetes, there's about 8 or 9 different policies you want to use there. So I group those into an initiative. You can then assign initiatives using an assignment, same way as you would with assigning a policy. But you can do that again at the management group or subscription or resource group scope. So anything within that scope will get those policies applied. Okay, so let's have a quick look at how we can do that using infrastructure as code. And we'll have a look first at doing policy assignments. And so we can have a look at a few different languages if you want. We've got ARM templates, Terraform, Pulumi. We'll start with ARM templates and see where we go from there. But we want to assign a policy. So we're going to assign an existing policy. So let's go and pick a policy that we're interested in. Let's change it to policy. And let's find a category. Let's find something fairly simple. Let's do storage. So here's one. Yeah, storage accounts should have infrastructure encryption. So all storage accounts should have encryption enabled. It's a fairly standard one, I would have thought. So we're going to want to assign that to our subscription. So let's open up Visual Studio Code. Get ourselves an ARM template. We could do this in Bicep as well, but I'll stick with ARM at the minute just because I've got the example open. And what we're interested in here is we'll basically copy and paste. Let's just take the resources section for now. Okay, so there's two things we need. So we're gonna hard code these on the assumption that we actually don't want to make this generic. This is actually about defining how we assign our policies in an actually more defined way. We don't want to make this a generic file that anyone can assign any policy with. This is a bit pointless. We want to actually have a file that documents how our policies are assigned. So we need to give it a name, and that's, I believe, a name that we can just give it. So infrastructure encryption. And we need the policy definition ID, which we should be able to get here. That's just the resource ID of that particular policy. And then we're going to need the scope. So where do we want to apply this policy? Do we want it at the subscription level? Do we want it at the resource group level? Do we want it at the management group level? And I'm going to say at this point, I want to deploy it at a subscription. So let's open another window in the portal and I'll get a subscription up. So let's do it at the management group. Let's see how that works. So we'll do it at this IT department. And I'm going to have to remember the syntax for how you address a management group, aren't I? Because there's no properties option in here. Just check the subscription one. I have to remember the syntax for the management group scope. We know because I can never remember it. Record IT department. Okay, so that's created that. So we want to go ahead and save this. Okay, so we should be able to now deploy that. So I'm not sure we spoke about this before, but This is one of those scenarios where we want to deploy at a different scope. So ARM templates and pretty much any other infrastructure as code that works with Azure have this concept of scopes. So the default one, when we do new AZ resource group deployment, that deploys at a resource group. So it puts everything within a resource group. But policies don't live at the resource group level. They live higher up the stack. They live in the management group or the subscription scope. So we need to use a different command to actually do that. So to tell it that we want to deploy at in this case, the management groups command. So there's a couple of other PowerShell commands. There's a new AZ management group deployment. There's also a new AZ subscription deployment, and a very rarely used new AZ tenant deployment command. So we're going to use the management group deployment one. Pick up the management group ID again. So I'll just steal it from here. Sure, the location actually matters for these, but we'll do one. I don't believe I've got any parameters here, or is it talking about the actual command? Still not name there, then, haven't I? Log in. So any questions on any of this, just let me know. I'm more than happy to answer questions on anything infrastructure as code related. Let's try this again. So the scope, it doesn't like the scope that we're doing here, so I've clearly screwed something up. Probably in the management group part. Yeah, so we shouldn't actually need that scope piece based on that. So let's just get rid of that. Interesting. So let's just check the docs, see what I'm doing wrong. So the management group ID should be the actual, that looks at the name of the management group. Fine. I don't need that. Okay, let's just try this. So still something up with that. Actually, not looking here. It does not give us the command, which is really helpful. So Yeah, something here is not really working all that well. So we just want the policy assignment, definition ID, organization policy definitions, which should be what we've got. Microsoft policy definitions, yeah. Okay, we could look at doing it this way. Let's try that. So this account is an admin, so there's no reason why I shouldn't have rights to do that. I spelled correctly. Okay, that looks better. It didn't like the. Yeah, well. Slightly different. Now it's complaining about syntax. The request content was invalid and could not be serialized. Its character or passing value square brackets. So have we got a syntax error somewhere? Is all right? Properties.scope. This one. Yeah, my fault. Put the quotes in the right places, it might help. Yeah, so this is the problem. I'm fairly sure, new AZ deployment is an alias for new AZ subscription deployment. So it's complaining about not being able to deploy the subscription. It was complaining the fact that it's trying to deploy the subscriptions, and I'm saying it should deploy the management group. To try and get past this problem, which is somewhat frustrating, I'm just going to change this to deploy at the subscription scope instead. Let's just get rid of that. Figure out why it doesn't work at management group later. We'll save you all the boredom of watching me trying to struggle with the command line. Now what? That in. Okay, so that's worked. So what we should now have is an assignment back over in our policy section. And what did we call it? This was infrastructure security, infrastructure encryption, wasn't it? So we did it at the subscription level. So it's going to be one of these. Or it's not, so there we go, it's just gone up there. So yeah, here we go. So this is the one we created. Cannot read property policy rule of undefined. That's really helpful. Other ones work. Yeah, so what we didn't do is we didn't pass any parameters, which should be okay, I think, because it should take the defaults. But we'll have to see if that was a problem. Everything else, this should be. Yeah, so what is wrong with that? There's nothing else in here that's getting assigned to this policy. So yeah, it should just take the default values of the property. So if we go have a look at the policy that we're trying to assign. So we were in storage, weren't we? Policy. Storage count should have infrastructure encryption enabled. So this has got properties. It's got effect, and that's it. So the effect is the only property it's got. It's got a default value of audit, so that should work. That should take that default value. So for some reason, it has, well, whether either not worked or it's just not showing up. I'm getting an error for some reason. Have a look in the compliance section. See if it actually shows up in here. Yeah, so we can see that it has shown up in here. And you see it's in a status of not started, so it hasn't actually done any auditing yet. So usually it'll take about 10 to 15 minutes or so for that to actually go off, and depending on how many resources you've got, it could be longer, but it'll go off and check the resources and come back with the compliant state. So at the minute, it's showing as not started, and I guess 100% compliance, which is 0 of 0. Yeah, that should go off in a minute. I don't know why in the assignment piece it's not actually showing. We go click on it. It should show us in here. I'm not entirely sure why it's doing that. Anyway, if we wanted to go in and change this, so let's say we wanted to update the properties, so the parameters here. Syntax for this. It's not going to show us how to do that, is it? Okay, we'll have a quick look at the definition of the policy. So the name of the parameter is effect, and the value is going to be audit. Or we want to change it to deny. That's right. Let's give that a go. And that's to switch it into deny mode. Yep. Okay. So in theory, the actual effect should take effect immediately. So we're going to go and add a storage account. We're done here. I'm going to resource groups. The thing we do need to do is make sure I'm using the right subscription. So we want that one. Do it here. So storage account. Oops. Okay, and what I want to do, if I can, is turn off encryption. It might not let me. Might have to do it through an ARM template. Okay, there we should. Okay, that's off by default anyway. Okay, so in theory, if we go ahead and try and create that, it should fail. But I would have thought it would have failed in the pre-flight check, so it's probably not going to fail. Yeah. So something's not quite right there. So let's have a look at the definition of that policy. So type storage account, require infrastructure encryption should be it's not equal to true. And if we go have a look at our storage account, and if we go look at the actual template, okay, I get a feeling that's not actually set to anything, which is possibly why. It's probably a bad example. Let's go pick another one. Let's go back to our storage accounts. And let's go find something that we can actually test that isn't a preview feature. So there you go. Storage account should restrict network access. So properties here. This basically requires that you turn on the storage firewall. It's got the same option. It's only got the deny one. So what we should be able to do is we should be able to come over here. I just need the ID here. Everything else. Name. Leave that in deny mode. Again. If anyone's got any questions, just ask. I'm more than happy to answer them. Okay, so we should now have that applied. So if we go to our compliance page, acquire storage firewall. We'll look to add another storage account. Okay, then in here, in one of these sections, yeah, so we're going to have public endpoint turned on. So that's basically the storage firewall is turned off. So we'll see if this will allow us. And if it does, then something's broken. And again, I would have expected that to fail earlier. So something is not working quite right, which is helpful when you try to do a demo. So let's look at the assignment. Okay, so it looks like the reason it's throwing an error is it doesn't actually, it doesn't appear to actually picked up the policy. So let's try and actually find the policy this time. That's the ID. I'm just going to try hard coding that. Okay, so it doesn't like that. Let's go and delete the old assignment. He says. Try that again. Okay, apparently still doesn't like. I'm just going to do that. Okay, that worked. Guess it didn't clean up quickly enough. Just wait for that to appear. Okay, that's better. That appears to actually have not errored. So let's go and create another storage account so we can see what this actually looks like and where it applies the policy. Default. Still not. There you go. Okay, I would have thought it would have failed earlier, but that's now failed. So if we have a look at this error, and you should now see somewhere that it's failed because of policy. Yeah, so there you go. So resource blah 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 was disallowed by policy. Let's listen to VS Code so we can read it better. Okay, so policy demo was disallowed by policy. Then it gives you the details of the actual policy, so you can find that the require storage firewall 02. And then we get some details here of the expression evaluated. So it expects the value here, this default action, to be set to basically turn off the firewall, and that's the value that gets applied. If it's not, so deny. So it's basically denied that storage account creation due to the fact that that policy is in place. Okay, and then what we will actually find is eventually, it's probably not ready yet, but if we have a look in our compliance section, it's not started yet, but eventually what it will do in here, it will show us the actual amount of policies that it will that are not in compliance with that. Okay, so that took longer than I intended. Apologies for that. We had some issues with my understanding of how the ARM template works. But that's how you can actually create an assignment. Now, the other option, so an initiative is very similar. It's just a case of having multiple policies inside the initiative and then assigning that. The policy definition itself, for custom policy definition, that's not very helpful. Compose the definition. Yeah, so this is what the actual policy would look like. So you've got to have these properties. So this is not an ARM template at this point. This is actually using the policy definition language. It's very similar to ARM templates, but it's not exactly the same. And if you want to deploy it using an ARM template, what you would do is you would create the policy definition using this language, and then you would wrap that in an ARM template to actually do the deployment. So you've got the name you want for the policy, the description for the policy, the mode. So you can actually hard code the mode if you want, or pass it in as a parameter. Any parameters you want to actually be passed into the policy, and then the actual policy rule. So this is where you would need to work out what you want your policy to do and figure out the language to determine that. Now, if it's just a simple thing of checking one field, then it should be fairly straightforward. So you can say, if this field equals this, then do something. If you want to do something complicated with multiple fields and using binary operators and so on, you'll need to go and have a look at the actual language definition for these things to figure out how you can do that. So here's an example. So you've got this this is where you want to look. So it checks both fields. So it checks that the field called type equals a storage account, and the field called HTTPS traffic only is equal to true. And that's all of, and there's a few others. There is a resource somewhere that will actually define the language that you can use to do that. So depending on how complicated you want your policies, that can get quite complex. What I would recommend is if you're getting started with using policies and you want to start implementing them in your environment, is to look at using the built-in ones first. Get familiar with using those, create assignments, create initiatives, and use those to start building these out before you start then creating custom policies if you need them. You'd be surprised how many policies there are and how many of them will probably do the job, particularly because a lot of them are parameterized, so you can actually pass in the values you're interested in to make sure the policy fits what you need. That's what I would suggest. Okay, well, we're up on the hour now, so I'm going to head off in a moment. If anyone's got any last-minute questions, just let us know now. Otherwise, I will drop off, and we'll see you again for next week's session. Hopefully found it useful. Apologies that it took a bit longer than I expected to deal with the ARM template option. I was going to have a look at doing it in Terraform as well, but obviously we got a bit stuck there with my inability to figure out why the deployment wasn't working. I'll try and fix the management group piece and figure out why that wasn't working, but hopefully that was still useful. So hopefully you found it all useful, and hopefully you have a good rest of your day, and I will see you next week.